Elizabeth of York, a name that echoes softly through the corridors of English history. She was the daughter of a king, the wife of a conqueror, and the mother of a dynasty that would forever change England, the Tudors. Yet despite her royal blood and pivotal role in ending the Wars of the Roses, her story is often overshadowed by the men around her. Her father, Edward IV, her uncle, Richard III, and her husband, Henry VII. But who was Elizabeth, truly? Beyond the titles and portraits, who was the woman who united two warring houses and became the quiet architect of peace in a broken kingdom? In this documentary, we'll uncover the untold story of Elizabeth of York, her childhood in a court of power and betrayal, her impossible choices during England's darkest years, and the legacy that lives on through the most famous monarch of all, her son, Henry VIII. If you love deep historical stories and forgotten royal figures, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and join us as we begin the journey into the remarkable life of Elizabeth of York. Elizabeth of York entered the world on February 11, 1466, in the royal palace of Westminster, born into a kingdom that was just beginning to recover from years of brutal civil war. Her father, King Edward IV, was a towering and charismatic figure, the first Yorkist king to claim the English throne after defeating the Lancastrian forces. Her mother, Elizabeth Woodville, was unlike any queen England had ever seen. She was not of royal birth, but a widow from a modest noble family who had married for love, not politics. Their union was a scandal that rippled through the English nobility. Yet, from this controversial marriage, a new royal family was born, and at its heart stood the bright, golden-haired child named Elizabeth of York. The court of Edward IV was one of pageantry, fashion, and new cultural ambition. The king's victories had brought peace, at least for a time, and the royal family became the embodiment of stability. Elizabeth grew up surrounded by luxury, wearing fine silks and jewels, educated by tutors who trained her in languages, music, and courtly grace. She was intelligent and composed, with the gentleness that would later define her public image. But beyond the glittering halls of Westminster, England was not as stable as it seemed. The Wars of the Roses had left deep scars. The nobility was divided, and old rivalries simmered beneath the surface. Elizabeth's father had seized the throne by force, and though he ruled with strength, his legitimacy remained a sensitive matter. The House of York's claim was built on the belief that the Lancastrians had usurped the crown generations earlier. Yet that same logic could easily be turned against Edward himself. Every triumph of the Yorks carried a shadow of uncertainty. The kingdom's peace rested not on mutual loyalty, but on Edward's ability to keep his ambitious lords in line. In this delicate balance, Elizabeth's mother became one of the most powerful and polarizing women in England. Elizabeth Woodville was proud, beautiful, and fiercely protective of her children. She elevated her large Woodville family into high positions at court, marrying her brothers and sisters into the nobility. To the old aristocracy, this was an unforgivable intrusion. They saw the Woodvilles as upstarts, greedy and manipulative, climbing to power on the back of an unworthy marriage. Whispered resentment spread through the halls of power, and with it grew the seeds of future betrayal. For young Elizabeth, these tensions were invisible, masked by the comfort of royal life. Her world was one of ceremony and security, of learning how to curtsy with grace and how to speak with the measured tone expected of a princess. Yet her upbringing was not simply ornamental. Edward IV valued image and unity, and his daughters were part of that grand display. Elizabeth, as the eldest child, represented the hope of a new dynasty, a symbol of peace after bloodshed. Her portrait, even as a young girl, reflected the perfect balance of her parents' ambitions: beauty, lineage, and quiet strength. But childhood in the royal household was never free from politics. Marriages were weapons, alliances to be forged with foreign crowns. Even before she could fully understand her position, Elizabeth's name was already spoken in diplomatic circles. Proposals came from across Europe, from the French court, from Burgundy, from the Scots, all seeing in her a key to power. Every smile, every word she learned, every public appearance was part of a greater performance written by others. Despite her father's charm and the glittering life around her, Elizabeth's world was not untouched by fear. Her father's enemies still plotted in the shadows, and rebellion flickered like embers waiting for wind. The Lancastrian cause was weakened but not dead. The line of Henry VI still had sympathizers, and many nobles who bowed to Edward's rule did so out of caution, not loyalty. At court, alliances shifted with dangerous speed. A careless word could mean ruin. Through it all, Elizabeth's mother remained the constant force in her life. Elizabeth Woodville was both mentor and guardian, teaching her daughter the art of composure, the necessity of silence, and the skill of reading the mood of a room, all essential survival traits for a woman of power in a man's world. The bond between them was deep, but it would soon be tested in ways neither could imagine. By the time Elizabeth reached adolescence, her father's fortunes seemed secure. He had restored royal authority, filled the court with wealth, and silenced his greatest rivals. The Yorkist sun was at its zenith, but beneath that brilliance, cracks were beginning to form. In politics, in loyalties, and within the royal family itself. The grandeur that surrounded Elizabeth's youth was a fragile facade, and its collapse would soon thrust her into the heart of one of the darkest chapters in English history. Her story was only beginning, and the Golden Princess of the House of York would soon learn that even royal blood could not shield her from the storm to come. In the spring of 1483, the golden world of Elizabeth of York shattered overnight. Her father, King Edward IV, who had seemed invincible, strong, charismatic, and larger than life, fell gravely ill. No one was prepared for his sudden decline, and when he died in April at the age of 40, the kingdom was left stunned. Elizabeth was just 17. Overnight, she went from being the daughter of a powerful monarch to a royal princess in a dangerously uncertain world. Her younger brother, Edward, became King Edward V, but he was only 12 years old, far too young to rule alone. What followed was not a peaceful transition, but a swift descent into chaos. Edward IV's death exposed the deep fractures within his court, rivalries that had simmered for years beneath the surface. The young king's maternal family, the Woodvilles, sought to control the regency, while others believed the king's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, should serve as protector of the realm. Elizabeth's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, was determined to safeguard her son's inheritance, but in doing so, she provoked the mistrust of powerful men who saw her family as ambitious and dangerous. At first, Richard of Gloucester seemed the perfect guardian. He was Edward IV's loyal brother, respected by the army and known for his discipline and integrity. But loyalty in this period was a fragile thing. Within weeks of Edward IV's funeral, Richard took control of the young king, arresting his Woodville relatives under accusations of treason. Elizabeth Woodville, sensing the danger, fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her daughters, including Elizabeth of York and her youngest son, the little Prince Richard, Duke of York. It was a time of fear and silence. Inside the cold stone walls of sanctuary, Elizabeth of York lived as a prisoner of circumstance. Outside, her uncle's power was growing rapidly. Richard had secured the person of the young King Edward V, keeping him under his protection in the Tower of London, which despite its name was still a royal residence. To the public it seemed a temporary measure. But weeks passed and Edward was not crowned. Then, in a shocking and calculated move, Richard declared that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, that the late king had been pre-contracted to another woman before their union. With that single claim, every child of Edward IV, including Elizabeth, was branded illegitimate. The throne was declared vacant. Parliament, under pressure, ratified Richard's claim, and in July 1483, he was crowned King Richard III. From the safety of sanctuary, Elizabeth of York watched her world collapse. Her brothers, Edward and Richard, were confined in the Tower, their fate uncertain. Rumors soon began to spread, whispers that the two princes had disappeared. No one could say for sure what had happened to them, but they were never seen again. The princes in the Tower, as history would call them, became one of the darkest mysteries of England. For Elizabeth, the loss was more than political. It was deeply personal. They were her little brothers, innocent, cheerful boys who had once run through the corridors of Westminster beside her. The silence that followed their disappearance was suffocating. The court did not speak of it openly, but everyone knew something terrible had occurred. Elizabeth Woodville was consumed by grief and fear. Her family's enemies were in power, and her daughters, though technically royal, were stripped of their titles and prospects. Elizabeth of York was now the eldest daughter of a disgraced and illegitimate line, a princess without a crown, a pawn without protection. For a time, she and her mother remained hidden within the sanctuary's thick walls, cut off from the court. The once proud Queen of England had been reduced to a desperate widow, negotiating for her family's survival. Richard III, seeking to stabilize his rule, eventually promised them safety. The women were allowed to return to court, but the atmosphere was heavy with suspicion. Elizabeth's beauty and poise drew attention and rumors. Some claimed Richard intended to marry her himself, to merge his claim with hers and silence the question of legitimacy forever. The idea horrified many, and though it is uncertain how serious Richard's intentions were, the gossip alone was enough to taint his reputation. For Elizabeth, it was a cruel irony. The uncle who had destroyed her family's future was now perhaps considering her as a bride. She learned to move carefully, to speak little, to survive. In this tense and dangerous world, she began to understand the full weight of power, not as privilege but as peril. Her father's glorious reign was gone, her brothers likely dead, and the name of York was now a whisper of rebellion rather than royalty. Yet beneath her quiet exterior, Elizabeth was not broken. The same composure that had been taught to her as a child, to endure, to observe, to wait, became her greatest defense. In those dark months, as England adjusted to its new king, a different future was quietly taking shape. Across the Channel, in exile, a distant relative of the Lancastrian line, Henry Tudor, was watching events unfold. And somewhere in the hidden corridors of English politics, plans were already being laid for an alliance that could restore Elizabeth's family name and change the course of the kingdom forever. Under the uneasy reign of Richard III, Elizabeth of York lived in the shadow of power and suspicion. The new king had claimed the throne in the name of stability, presenting himself as a reformer, a ruler devoted to justice and order after years of corruption. Yet his legitimacy was fragile, built upon the ruins of his brother's legacy and the disappearance of two innocent princes. England was uneasy. The streets of London whispered with rumors of ghosts in the Tower, of betrayal and blood, of a crown taken but never earned. And in the center of it all stood Elizabeth, the niece of the king, the daughter of a dethroned monarch, and the last surviving heir of the Yorkist line who could threaten his rule. When Elizabeth and her sisters were brought from sanctuary and restored to court in early 1484, the world they returned to was profoundly changed. Their mother's influence had vanished, their titles were uncertain, and every smile at court concealed calculation. Richard's queen, Anne Neville, was frail and ill. Her health was failing, and whispers began to circulate that Richard, widowed or not, might take Elizabeth as his new wife. The rumors spread with alarming speed, fueled by her beauty, by the political logic of uniting the Yorkist claim, and by the silent tension between uncle and niece whenever they appeared together in public. Chroniclers of the time and later generations debated endlessly whether there was any truth to it. Some claimed Elizabeth herself was fond of Richard, or at least flattered by his attention. Others believed she was horrified by the idea. But whatever her private feelings, she understood the danger of every gesture, every look, every word that passed between them. In a world where alliances were written in blood and marriage was power, she had to tread with perfect precision. Richard's wife, Queen Anne, grew weaker by the month, and when she died in March 1485, the gossip reached a fever pitch. People whispered that the Queen had been poisoned, a suspicion so widespread that Richard was forced to publicly deny any plan to marry his niece. Still, the damage was done. His image was tarnished, and even his most loyal supporters began to question his judgment. Elizabeth, caught in the storm, was forced once again into silence, her reputation hanging in the balance of forces she could not control. Her mother, Elizabeth Woodville, however, was not silent. Behind the veil of obedience, she began to weave a network of alliances. The former queen understood that the House of York, as it stood, could not survive on its own. Her sons were gone, her daughters politically vulnerable, and her brother-in-law's reign unstable. So she turned her gaze toward an unexpected source of salvation, the exiled heir of the rival Lancastrian line, Henry Tudor. Henry was living in Brittany, the son of Margaret Beaufort, a woman of relentless ambition and shrewd intellect. His claim to the throne was tenuous at best, descended from John of Gaunt through an illegitimate line. But in times of uncertainty, even a weak claim could become a weapon. Margaret and Elizabeth Woodville, though once enemies by blood, found themselves united by necessity. Through secret correspondence, they formed a daring plan. If Henry could defeat Richard and take the throne, he would marry Elizabeth of York, uniting the White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster at last. The marriage would be more than symbolic. It would heal decades of civil war and give Henry VIII rule the legitimacy it otherwise lacked. For Elizabeth, it would mean reclaiming her place as queen not through conquest but through union. It was a dangerous gamble. Letters were carried across the Channel in secrecy, coded and concealed, as the two mothers shaped a pact that could topple a king. Meanwhile, Elizabeth lived under watchful eyes. Richard's court was filled with unease. His reign, though outwardly firm, was haunted by rebellion. Discontent brewed in the north and in Wales, and whispers of a Lancastrian uprising reached even the royal chambers. Elizabeth moved through this tense atmosphere with the grace of a survivor, neither defiant nor submissive, quietly embodying the very unity Richard lacked. Every noble at court knew that her marriage could decide the future of England. In private, she must have felt the weight of her role. The death of her brothers had stolen her childhood. The fall of her family had taken her innocence. Now she existed in a twilight state, both a reminder of the past and a promise of what could come next. Those who saw her described her as serene, composed, yet distant, as if she carried secrets that could not be spoken aloud. In the summer of 1485, as Richard tightened his grip on power, the storm that had been gathering for years finally began to break. News arrived that Henry Tudor was preparing to invade England, supported by exiles, rebels, and those who had lost faith in Richard's cause. The pact forged by two women in the shadows was about to be tested in open battle. For Elizabeth of York, it meant everything: her fate, her family's restoration, and the fragile hope of peace. She waited in silent suspense, knowing that whichever banner triumphed at Bosworth would determine whether she lived as a queen or perished as the last daughter of a fallen house. Across the Channel, far from the intrigues of Richard III's court, a young exile was preparing to gamble everything on a single desperate bid for the English crown. Henry Tudor had lived most of his life in uncertainty, shaped by the long shadow of civil war. Born in Wales, his claim to the throne was faint. Through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, he descended from John of Gaunt, son of Edward III. But that lineage passed through the Beauforts, a family once declared illegitimate. It was a weak thread on which to hang a crown, and Henry knew it. Yet history often turns on fragile threads, and his greatest strength was not blood, but timing. England was weary of division. The Yorkist regime was faltering. Richard III, despite his careful governance, had lost the people's trust. In exile, Henry became the symbol of resistance. He had spent years moving between Brittany and France, watched and sometimes manipulated by foreign powers who saw him as a pawn to be used against Richard. But Henry was more patient and more cunning than many expected. He had the steady pragmatism of his mother and the endurance of a survivor. When word reached him that discontent in England was rising, that nobles who had once sworn loyalty to Richard were turning away, he saw his moment approaching. The promise of marriage to Elizabeth of York became the heart of his cause. It was not merely a romantic notion, it was a political masterstroke. To the Yorkists who still mourned Edward IV, Elizabeth represented legitimacy, continuity, and the innocence destroyed by Richard's usurpation. To the Lancastrians, Henry embodied justice and retribution for decades of defeat. Together they would fuse two broken symbols into one powerful emblem, the red and white roses entwined. This promise was Henry's greatest weapon. His army was small, his resources limited, but his message was powerful. He would end the wars, restore order, and marry the true heir of York. Even before setting foot on English soil, Henry swore that if he triumphed, Elizabeth would be his queen. The union would not simply heal the kingdom's divisions, it would erase them. In August 1485, Henry Tudor landed on the coast of Wales with a modest army of French mercenaries and loyal Welshmen. His march through the countryside was cautious but steady. As he advanced, supporters began to join him, some driven by loyalty to the Lancastrian cause, others by disillusionment with Richard's rule. The decisive confrontation came on August 22nd in a quiet field near Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. The Battle of Bosworth was not merely a clash of armies, it was the last act of the Wars of the Roses. Richard's forces outnumbered Henry's, and on paper his position was stronger. But the loyalties of key nobles wavered. In the chaos of battle, Lord Stanley, whose wife was none other than Henry's mother, Margaret Beaufort, turned against Richard at the crucial moment. Richard, defiant to the end, charged into combat, fighting his way toward Henry himself. It was a moment of raw courage and tragic futility. Surrounded and overpowered, the last Yorkist king fell on the battlefield, his crown lost in the mud and found later hanging from a thorn bush. When the dust settled, Henry Tudor stood victorious. With Richard's death, the Plantagenet line ended, and the Tudor era began. Henry was crowned King Henry VII on the field, the golden circlet placed upon his head by Lord Stanley, in a gesture both symbolic and political. Yet Henry understood that victory on the battlefield did not guarantee peace. His claim to the throne was fragile. It rested on conquest, not inheritance. To truly secure his rule, he needed legitimacy, and legitimacy meant Elizabeth of York. Henry entered London as a conqueror, but acted as a careful strategist. He declared his reign to have begun the day before Bosworth, ensuring that anyone who had fought for Richard could be accused of treason. At the same time, he ordered the arrest of surviving Yorkist claimants and began to rebuild royal authority with methodical precision. But amid this consolidation of power, one matter remained unresolved: his marriage. In January 1486, Henry fulfilled his vow. The wedding of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York was celebrated in Westminster Abbey, uniting the warring houses of Lancaster and York in a single royal family. The symbolism was profound. The red rose of Lancaster merged with the white rose of York to create the Tudor rose, a new emblem for a new dynasty. The ceremony was not lavish, but its meaning resonated across England. For the first time in decades, there was a sense, however fragile, that peace might be possible. Yet Henry was cautious. He made sure to claim the throne by his own right, not through his wife's blood. Parliament confirmed his kingship before the marriage took place, a deliberate move to ensure that Elizabeth's claim could not be used to challenge his authority. It was a subtle act of political control, the first of many that would define his reign. For Elizabeth, the marriage marked both an end and a beginning. She was no longer a pawn between factions. She was now queen of a reconciled kingdom, though her role would remain largely symbolic. Her calm presence, her grace, and her Yorkist lineage helped soften the public's view of Henry's austere rule. She embodied the peace he promised, a living reminder that the roses, once drenched in blood, could finally bloom together. But even as the Tudor rose blossomed, the scars of the past lingered. Rumors persisted that the younger of Elizabeth's brothers might still be alive, hidden somewhere abroad. Pretenders would rise in years to come, threatening the fragile new order. For now, however, the kingdom celebrated its long-awaited peace. The girl who had once lived in the shadows of loss now stood beside the man who had turned exile into empire. Together, the first monarchs of a new and cautious age. Elizabeth of York was crowned Queen of England on November 25, 1487, nearly 2 years after her marriage to Henry VII. The delay was not accidental. Henry, ever the strategist, had waited until the early turbulence of his reign began to settle. The ceremony was grand and symbolic, a public declaration that the wars were truly over, that the white rose of York and the red rose of Lancaster now bloomed on a single stem. As Elizabeth processed through London, the streets were adorned with Tudor emblems, banners of crimson and white entwined, and tapestries depicting peace restored to the realm. To the people of England, she was the image of reconciliation, a living promise that the years of betrayal, blood, and factional hatred had finally ended. Yet behind the pageantry, the new royal household was shaped by careful calculation. Henry VII was a man who trusted few and loved fewer. His life in exile had taught him to rely only on discipline and control. Even as he shared the throne with Elizabeth, he remained determined to rule by his own claim, not hers. He was the first Tudor king, and his legitimacy, fragile though it was, had to stand independent of the Yorkist blood that flowed through his wife's veins. Elizabeth understood this instinctively. From her youth, she had learned that survival in royal politics required silence, grace, and perception. Her role was to embody peace, not to shape policy. While her image shone in portraits and ceremonies, her real influence at court was subtle, almost invisible. She was admired by those around her for her gentleness and generosity, yet she moved with quiet restraint. She was queen, but never in command. At Henry's side stood another powerful woman, his mother, Margaret Beaufort. Stern, pious, and relentlessly ambitious, Margaret had fought for decades to see her son on the throne. Now that her goal was achieved, she did not intend to fade into the background. She styled herself "My Lady the King's Mother," a title that symbolized both reverence and authority. At court, she often presided alongside Henry, issuing orders, managing estates, and even influencing matters of state. The dynamic between the three, Henry, Elizabeth, and Margaret, was complex. Elizabeth was the queen, but Margaret often behaved as though she were co-sovereign. Many observed that Elizabeth's courtly dignity and calm nature allowed her to endure her mother-in-law's dominance without open conflict. Still, the balance of power was unmistakable. Henry's loyalty and affection were primarily directed toward his mother. Elizabeth, though respected, often found herself secondary in both politics and in personal affection. Yet, her very restraint became a form of quiet strength. The court that Henry and Elizabeth built was a new kind of monarchy, one that relied on order, control, and moral discipline rather than lavish displays of chivalric heroism. Gone were the reckless feasts and flamboyant tournaments of her father's reign. In their place came efficiency, bureaucracy, and an almost moral austerity. The Queen's presence softened this severity. Her warmth, her elegance, and her Yorkist charm made the Tudor image palatable to a weary nation. Elizabeth's household became the heart of royal domesticity. She presided over the upbringing of her children, the management of her ladies, and the rituals of royal motherhood that reinforced the dynasty's strength. The birth of Prince Arthur in 1486 was met with national celebration, the long-awaited symbol of peace embodied in a single child. For Henry, Arthur was the living proof that his dynasty would endure. For Elizabeth, he was the answer to years of anxiety, the fulfillment of her role as both queen and reconciler. Despite this harmony, tension lingered beneath the surface. Elizabeth's family, the Woodvilles and surviving Yorkist kin, remained under suspicion. Henry, paranoid about threats to his throne, kept a careful distance from them. Even Elizabeth's own cousins and half-brothers were watched, and in some cases imprisoned. Her mother, Elizabeth Woodville, who had once orchestrated alliances and shaped royal politics, was quietly removed from court and sent to live in seclusion at Bermondsey Abbey. It was a subtle exile, a clear signal that the new king tolerated no rival influence, not even from the Queen's bloodline. For Elizabeth, this must have been painful. She was devoted to her mother, yet powerless to intervene. It was the same pattern repeated. Her life defined by loss and restraint, her emotions masked behind a serene smile. Still, she performed her duties flawlessly, and her popularity among the people remained strong. The common folk adored her. To them, she was not merely the wife of the king, but the daughter of Edward IV, the golden princess of a gentler age, now transformed into the queen who had brought peace. Her presence at court became a kind of emotional counterbalance to Henry's austerity. While he imposed order through policy and fear, she embodied stability through grace. Foreign ambassadors noted her dignity, her beauty, and her modesty. They described a queen who rarely spoke in council, but whose quiet influence soothed those around her. It was said that she had a countenance full of calm and mildness, a rare light in a court often overshadowed by suspicion. Publicly, Henry and Elizabeth appeared the ideal royal couple, united, virtuous, and dedicated to peace. But privately, their marriage was a partnership of necessity more than passion. Henry's heart belonged to his duty and his trust to his mother. Elizabeth's strength lay in endurance. Together they built a dynasty, but separately they lived parallel lives within the same palace walls. Still, the image they projected, the serene queen and the prudent king, became one of the most enduring in English history. It was a carefully crafted illusion, yet a necessary one. England, exhausted from decades of civil war, needed to believe in unity, in family, in a royal marriage that could heal old wounds. And in Elizabeth's gentle smile, the nation found that illusion made real. She had begun life as a symbol of hope, and as queen, she remained one. Yet in the quiet halls of the Tudor court, beneath the polished surface of order and peace, Elizabeth of York lived a life of sacrifice, the price of holding together a kingdom built upon fragile reconciliation. As queen, Elizabeth of York embodied an ideal that was both deeply personal and profoundly political, the mother of a new England. Her role was not defined by decrees or councils, but by something far more symbolic, her ability to give the Tudor dynasty a future. Every child she bore strengthened Henry VII's claim. Every christening was a political act, every cradle a declaration that the Wars of the Roses were truly over. In an age when the stability of a kingdom depended upon heirs, Elizabeth's fertility became the foundation of royal legitimacy. Her firstborn, Prince Arthur, had already fulfilled a prophecy of sorts. Named for the legendary British king, his birth in September 1486 was hailed as a divine blessing upon the new regime. Songs were written in his honor, and Henry commissioned elaborate celebrations to announce to the world that the Tudors were chosen by God. Elizabeth's confinement and recovery were observed with reverence. Her successful delivery symbolized not only dynastic continuity, but peace reborn from civil bloodshed. She was praised as the true unifier, the flower of both houses, a living embodiment of the red and white rose intertwined. Elizabeth took pride in her motherhood, but she was not sentimentalized at court. Her value was measured by her womb and by her composure. She bore 7 children in all, though only 4 survived infancy: Arthur, Margaret, Henry, and Mary. Each was raised not only as a child of affection, but as an instrument of diplomacy. Marriages would one day turn them into bridges of peace across Europe, weapons of alliance in a continent still watching to see if the Tudors could endure. Prince Arthur, the eldest, was the pride of both parents, scholarly, devout, and solemn beyond his years. From birth, he was groomed to inherit not just the crown, but the burden of uniting England's divided past. His education was overseen by the greatest minds of the realm, and Elizabeth ensured that his upbringing combined the strength of Yorkist lineage with the discipline of his father's Lancastrian vision. She wrote to him often when he was sent to Ludlow Castle to preside, symbolically, over the Council of Wales, expressing the gentleness and moral guidance of a mother whose presence lingered even from afar. The second surviving son, Henry, was a very different child, energetic, impulsive, and magnetic. Where Arthur was measured, Henry was exuberant. Elizabeth adored him, and perhaps sensed in his confidence a reflection of her own father, Edward IV, whose charm and vigor had once dazzled the realm. She nurtured his education with care, ensuring that he was fluent in languages, skilled in music, and well-versed in theology and politics. Yet she could not have imagined that this boy, once the spare auntie, would one day become one of England's most infamous kings. Elizabeth's daughters too played vital roles in her vision of dynastic security. Margaret would be sent north to Scotland, becoming queen to James IV, uniting the Tudor line with that of the Stuarts, a union that generations later would bring the crowns of England and Scotland together. Mary, the youngest, would later become Queen of France, sealing the Tudors' place among Europe's royal houses. For Elizabeth, every child's future was woven into the fabric of diplomacy. Motherhood was her duty, but also her statecraft. At court, Elizabeth's presence offered balance to Henry's severity. While the king was cautious, often suspicious to the point of coldness, she exuded warmth and humanity. She was the gentle face of the monarchy, receiving ambassadors, presiding over charitable works, and offering patronage to religious institutions. Her faith was sincere and quiet. She endowed chapels, funded masses for the souls of the dead, and maintained the traditional rituals that comforted a still fractured nation. Her diplomacy was conducted not through edicts, but through empathy. She knew how to soothe tensions, both political and personal. When disputes arose among courtiers, or when noble families sought favor, it was often Elizabeth who intervened behind the scenes, offering intercession or a calming word. Her correspondence reveals a woman who understood the subtleties of power, that sometimes peace was best maintained not through command, but through kindness. And yet, beneath her serene exterior, Elizabeth lived under unrelenting pressure. Every pregnancy carried risk. Every miscarriage or stillbirth threatened not only her health, but the stability of the realm. The death of her infant sons, Edmund in 1500 and another unnamed child before him, brought quiet despair to a queen expected to smile through grief. She bore her losses in silence, as queens were expected to, but those who knew her spoke of her piety deepening, her eyes softening with sorrow that never fully left her. At the same time, Elizabeth's relationship with Henry was one of duty rather than intimacy. They respected one another, but Henry's reserve and obsession with control left little room for affection. His trust remained with his mother, Margaret Beaufort, who still wielded considerable authority within the household. Even as Elizabeth fulfilled every expectation of queenship, she lived within boundaries carefully drawn by her husband's cautious mind. Still, she found meaning in her role. Her children adored her, the people loved her, and even foreign envoys wrote of her gentleness and dignity. In her, England saw a queen who brought grace to austerity, humanity to policy, and light to the cold machinery of power. Elizabeth of York's motherhood was more than a personal experience. It was the quiet architecture upon which the Tudor dynasty was built. She created a household defined by loyalty and learning, and in her children she nurtured the future of a kingdom once torn apart. Her strength lay not in command, but in constancy. Through her calm presence, she gave England something that neither war nor politics could ever secure, the feeling that peace at last had a mother's face. In the spring of 1502, a chill seemed to settle over England that no sun could lift. News had arrived from Ludlow Castle that Prince Arthur, the long-awaited heir of the Tudor dynasty, was dead. He was just 15 years old. For Elizabeth of York and Henry VII, the loss was more than personal grief. It was the shattering of the very foundation upon which their reign had been built. Arthur was not only their son, he was the symbol of unity, the embodiment of peace after decades of war. His death tore open wounds that had barely healed, both within the kingdom and within the royal marriage itself. The prince had been sent to Ludlow shortly after his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. The union had been meant to secure an enduring alliance, tying England to one of the most powerful monarchies in Europe. But only months after the wedding, a sudden illness, perhaps the sweating sickness or consumption, swept through Ludlow. Within days, the young prince's health declined, and on April 2nd, he was gone. His young bride, barely 16, survived, but the promise of the Tudor future died with him. When word reached the royal court, Elizabeth was overcome with grief. Chroniclers describe her collapsing upon hearing the news, crying out for her son with the anguish of a mother stripped of purpose. Yet, as was expected of queens, she gathered herself quickly, sending comfort to her husband instead of seeking it. Henry, for all his discipline and composure, was devastated. He wept openly, a rare glimpse of the man behind the monarch. For the first time in years, the walls of control he had so carefully built began to crack. One account tells that Henry shut himself in his chambers, refusing food and counsel. When Elizabeth entered to console him, she reminded him gently that they were still young enough to have more children, that God had given them others to love. But when she returned to her own room, she broke down again, overcome by her own loss. It was a moment of shared sorrow that briefly united them, two parents mourning not as king and queen, but as husband and wife. Yet that tenderness, fleeting as it was, would soon give way to silence. Arthur's death reignited all of Henry's deepest fears, fear of instability, of rebellion, of the fragile legitimacy of his crown. With the heir gone, the focus of succession shifted to the younger son, Prince Henry, who was then only 10 years old. Henry VII's natural paranoia intensified. Every illness, every rumor, every whisper of dissent was magnified in his mind. He tightened his control over the court, over the treasury, over the very movement of his family. Elizabeth, still mourning, found herself surrounded by the same cold caution that had always defined her husband's reign, now sharpened by grief. The court itself became somber and restrained. The laughter that once echoed in the Queen's apartments grew rare. Elizabeth's health, weakened by years of childbearing and sorrow, began to decline. Yet despite her fragility, she did what was expected. She comforted, she endured, and she gave hope where she could. In February 1503, she gave birth to another daughter, Catherine, at the Tower of London. The child died within days, and soon after, so did Elizabeth. She was only 37 years old. Her final confinement was difficult from the start. The winter was cold, her body exhausted. As the days passed, fever set in, and the royal physicians could do little to help. Henry, though emotionally distant, was deeply affected. He ordered constant prayers for her recovery, yet he did not sit at her bedside. It was not in his nature to face death directly. He had always preferred to manage, to control, to plan. But this was something even he could not govern. When Elizabeth died on February 11th, her birthday, the king withdrew into isolation once again. Chroniclers note that Henry's grief was profound but private. He dressed in mourning black, shut himself away in his private chambers and refused visitors. The court grew hushed as though a light had gone out. Elizabeth's passing stripped the palace of warmth. Servants spoke of a chill that lingered long after the funeral, as if the Queen's death had drained not only the king as spirit, but the heart of the Tudor household itself. In their marriage, there had always been a divide. Henry ruled through reason, Elizabeth lived through quiet feeling. She had accepted his distance, his suspicion, his ceaseless need for control. But in the years following Arthur's death, that divide became an abyss. They shared grief, but not solace. Henry withdrew into his work, into finance and policy, into the endless management of his fragile realm. Elizabeth, by contrast, turned to faith, finding comfort in prayer and devotion. It was as though they mourned in parallel worlds, side by side yet apart. Her death marked a turning point for Henry. Those who knew him said that he was never the same afterward. The man who had once been cautious became consumed by fear of mortality. He grew reclusive, distrustful, and miserly. Without Elizabeth, the court lost its grace. The Queen had been the gentle equilibrium to his severity, the soft face of a hard regime. In her absence, the cold efficiency of Tudor rule hardened further. Elizabeth of York had entered the world as a symbol of hope, and she left it the same way. Her life had been marked by endurance, through war, loss, and the careful performance of duty. In death, she became idealized, the perfect queen, the virtuous mother, the quiet strength behind a calculating king. For Henry, she remained the one person who had represented peace not as strategy, but as presence. And as he aged, surrounded by suspicion and loneliness, it was perhaps Elizabeth's memory, her calm voice, her measured kindness that haunted him most. The dynasty she had helped create would go on to dominate English history, but the unity it symbolized began to fade with her passing. Without Elizabeth, the rose of England still bloomed, but its fragrance was colder and its thorns sharper than ever. The morning of February 11th, 1503, dawned grey and heavy over the Tower of London. Inside its cold stone walls, Elizabeth of York lay in her chamber, weakened and feverish after giving birth to her 8th child. The baby girl, named Catherine, lived only a few days. Elizabeth's body, already fragile from years of pregnancies, could not endure the strain. The Queen died on her 37th birthday, leaving behind a grieving husband, 4 surviving children, and a court that had long depended upon her quiet grace. Her death sent ripples through the kingdom. The woman who had personified peace, who had embodied the very unity of the Tudor claim, was gone. To the people of England, Elizabeth's passing felt like the breaking of a spell. For nearly 2 decades, she had stood as a symbol of calm amid the political storms that still threatened the realm. Her beauty, her kindness, her composure, all had served as the gentle counterweight to the cold precision of her husband's rule. Without her, the court lost its balance. The official mourning was grand but restrained, in keeping with the Tudor temperament. Henry VII ordered elaborate funeral rites, though his grief was expressed less in public ceremony than in private anguish. He withdrew into seclusion at Richmond Palace, refusing to see anyone for days. Chroniclers wrote that the king, normally so controlled, was sorely wounded in heart. Servants found him pale and silent, pacing the chambers where he and Elizabeth had once lived, clutching the small relics she had left behind. The funeral procession was somber and majestic. Elizabeth's coffin, draped in cloth of gold, was carried through the streets of London to Westminster Abbey, followed by mourners dressed in deep black. Bells tolled across the city as the cortege passed, and the people, many of whom had never seen her in person, knelt in silence. To them, Elizabeth had been the embodiment of royal virtue, the soft light of the Tudor age. Her body was laid to rest in the Lady Chapel of the Abbey, where Henry would one day join her. But for all the outward solemnity, her death exposed the fragility of Henry's carefully constructed world. The Queen had been not just his wife, but his most effective political symbol, the living proof that York and Lancaster were reconciled. With her gone, the Tudor dynasty felt less secure. Old Yorkist loyalties, once pacified by her presence, began to stir again. Henry, already a man of deep suspicion, became consumed by paranoia. He intensified his network of spies, tightened his grip on the nobility, and treated every potential rival, real or imagined, as a threat to the peace his wife had represented. In the royal household, Elizabeth's absence was felt most acutely by her children. Prince Henry, then 11 years old, was devastated. His mother had been his source of affection in a court that offered little warmth. Where his father's love was distant and pragmatic, Elizabeth's had been sincere and gentle. She had encouraged his curiosity, his charm, his exuberant personality. After her death, the boy's upbringing changed dramatically. Henry VII, wary of losing another heir, became possessive and cautious. The young prince was separated from many of his companions, confined more strictly to the routines of education and etiquette. The contrast between his earlier, lively childhood and the rigid atmosphere that followed left a lasting mark on the boy who would one day be Henry VIII. He grew up without the softness his mother had provided, surrounded instead by the shadows of fear and duty. His father's court was not a place of affection, but of calculation, and the warmth that Elizabeth had brought to family life was replaced by an air of solemn control. Even as he matured into the confident, charismatic prince known for his intellect and athleticism, there lingered in him a hunger for admiration, a craving perhaps for the kind of unconditional love his mother had once given. Princess Margaret, Elizabeth's eldest daughter, also felt the loss deeply. Only 13 at the time, she had been close to her mother, whose grace and poise she would later emulate as Queen of Scots. The youngest surviving daughter, Mary, was just 7, too young to fully grasp what had been taken from her, yet old enough to remember the absence of her mother's voice and touch. The royal children were now raised largely under the supervision of Margaret Beaufort, their formidable grandmother, whose piety and strictness shaped their early years. Though devoted, she was not affectionate in the way Elizabeth had been. Elizabeth's death also altered Henry VII himself in lasting ways. Already cautious by nature, he became increasingly withdrawn, haunted by illness and the specter of mortality. He turned ever more obsessively to the details of finance and administration, seeking control in numbers where he could no longer find it in life. The court grew austere, its gaiety extinguished. Even celebrations were subdued, as though joy itself had died with the Queen. Ambassadors who visited England in the years that followed noted a palpable melancholy surrounding the king, a man burdened by the memory of a woman who had once humanized his rule. In the broader sense, Elizabeth's passing marked the end of an era. The early Tudor court, once defined by optimism and renewal, sank into solemnity. The vision of reconciliation that had begun with her marriage faded into a reign characterized by suspicion and control. And yet, even in death, Elizabeth continued to shape the future. Her children, raised on the legacy of her gentleness and her quiet strength, would carry forward the Tudor image she had crafted, regal, composed, and deeply aware of the weight of destiny. When Henry VII died 6 years later, He ordered to be buried beside her in a magnificent marble tomb, their effigies carved to rest, hand in hand. It was a rare gesture of tenderness from a king not known for sentiment. In life, Elizabeth had been the peace he sought but could never fully possess. In death, she remained the still center of the dynasty he built, the woman who united a broken realm and, even in her absence, continued to define the heart of the Tudor crown. In the years following Elizabeth of York's death, her image began to transcend the woman she had been. She became not just a queen remembered, but a myth reborn, the serene, silent figure at the root of the Tudor legend. History, written by her husband's successors and burnished by the grandeur of her son, Henry VIII, transformed her into something more than human, the mother of the dynasty, the living emblem of peace after chaos, the rose that united red and white. Yet behind the polished portraits and heraldic poetry lay the truth of a woman whose quiet power had held together a kingdom still trembling from war. Elizabeth's role in shaping England's destiny was subtle but profound. She did not rule from the throne, nor issue decrees or lead armies. Her influence was woven through diplomacy, family, and symbolism, in the way she soothed division simply by existing, in the way her marriage to Henry VII legitimized a fragile claim and made peace believable again. Without her, the Tudors might have been just another fleeting house in England's turbulent succession. With her, they became destiny itself. Henry VII understood this from the start. Throughout his reign, he used Elizabeth's image as a political emblem, a visible sign that the war between York and Lancaster had ended. Their joint coat of arms, the red and white Tudor rose, was not merely decoration but propaganda, the merging of two royal lines into one. In public ceremonies, Elizabeth's presence was carefully choreographed to reinforce this harmony. She was often placed beside her husband in state processions, her golden hair crowned with jewels, her face composed into calm perfection. Chroniclers compared her to the Virgin Mary, describing her as full of grace and gentle above all women. Yet unlike her mother, Elizabeth Woodville, who had been criticized for ambition and political maneuvering, Elizabeth of York's legacy was one of restraint. She seemed to understand that her strength lay in stillness, that in an age of suspicion, serenity could be the most disarming form of influence. While others fought for control, she offered something rarer: stability. Her silence was not submission but strategy, her composure a form of command. In a world ruled by men, she wielded power invisibly, through affection, through mediation, through the quiet moral authority that outlived her voice. In art and memory, that silence became her defining feature. Portraits painted during and after her lifetime portray a queen both radiant and remote. Her gaze is soft but distant, her expression serene, her beauty idealized into a kind of sacred calm. In the paintings commissioned by her son, Henry VIII, decades later, Elizabeth is shown as the eternal mother, pale, perfect and timeless, surrounded by symbols of unity and rebirth. The real woman who had known fear, grief and exhaustion was replaced by an icon. She became the personification of England's rebirth, the matriarch whose very bloodline justified the Tudors' right to rule. This transformation was deliberate. The Tudor court understood the power of image as keenly as it did the power of the sword. To secure their fragile dynasty, they crafted a narrative of divine providence, that the chaos of the Wars of the Roses had been resolved not by mere chance or conquest, but by the destined union of Henry and Elizabeth. The story was told in poetry, in pageantry and heraldry, and at its center stood Elizabeth, silent and shining. Her life was rewritten into allegory, her humanity softened into symbol. Her legacy also endured through her children, especially in the figure of Henry VIII. The young prince had inherited not only her golden coloring and charisma, but her sense of destiny. Though his reign would become infamous for its cruelty and excess, it was also a continuation of his mother's promise, the creation of a unified, powerful England, the splendor of the Tudor court, the revival of art and culture, the assertion of royal majesty. All these flourished in the shadow of Elizabeth's image. Even as Henry remade the English church and broke with Rome, he carried within him the aura of the peace-born dynasty, his mother had made possible. In later centuries, writers and historians continued to shape Elizabeth's memory to fit their times. To the Victorians, she was the ideal woman, pure, loyal, maternal, and self-sacrificing. To modern historians, she has become a symbol of quiet resilience, her restraint seen not as passivity, but as intelligence. She lived in a world where women's power was confined to the private sphere, yet within those boundaries, she altered the course of English history. Her gentleness stabilized a dynasty. Her marriage ended a civil war. Her children carried her blood into an age that would define Britain's identity for generations. Elizabeth's true genius lay in her understanding of presence, of what it meant to embody peace rather than to demand it. She had witnessed the collapse of kings and the vanishing of brothers, the suspicion that poisoned courts, the fragility of crowns. From those lessons, she learned that endurance could be its own form of rule. She built no monuments, issued no proclamations, and yet her legacy stands among the most enduring of all English queens. In the grand tomb at Westminster Abbey, she and Henry lie side by side, carved in cold marble, but joined by a single clasped hand. Around them, the Tudor rose blooms in sculpted stone, a reminder of the marriage that ended an age of war and began a new one. Visitors who gaze upon those effigies often remark on the serenity of her face, the peace that seems to radiate from her stillness. It is fitting, for that peace was her life's work. Elizabeth of York may not have ruled a nation by decree, but she shaped its soul. Through her, England found reconciliation. Through her children, it found greatness. And through her legend, it found the image of harmony it longed to believe in. She remains, centuries later, the silent architect of the Tudor myth, the queen who spoke little, but changed everything.